Since you guys made it into the auditorium on time, I wanted to treat you to an extra special transition on my slides here. First, this is Matters of State, and I'm Kris Wallsmith. I want to be sure we're all on the same spot and everybody's watching the screen. Ooh. 10 years old, oh my goodness. That's pretty crazy. My daughter is 10 years old. She just got through that awkward time, and now she's, becoming a pretty solid person. And I think Symfony is super solid also. I'm kind of bracing myself for the teenage years. Hopefully that'll go smoothly for us and for my kids. Symfony turning 10, PHP 7 was released today, Symfony 3.0 was released, Blackfire 2.0. There's so much awesome stuff happening right now. It's a really exciting time to be in PHP. Let's see. That's probably enough fun with the animations. So this is a little bit about me, where you can find me. I'm really happy to be here today. It's always fun to get up in front of a crowd. I want to be an actor when I grow up, so this is just perfect. The bright lights. I just need some backup dancers. Ryan? No? Jeremy? Yeah, and I really appreciate everybody, all of you being here as well. I acknowledge that some of us probably did some soul searching before coming to Paris for this, and I appreciate that you all made the decision you did. I especially, coming from the States and looking at what's happening there now, am feeling a little silly about having been afraid to come here. But I don't want to get into U.S. politics. Let's talk about something a little less controversial, like doctrine events. You guys like jokes? Okay, so a man walks into a logical ore. I don't get it either. Okay, so this talk springs from a talk that I've done in the past called How Kris Writes Symphony Apps. This is a talk where I go over a number of different things about what I personally do when I sit down to write an application. So this springs from that. Lately, I've been doing a lot of work on single-page apps and using React quite a bit. Has anybody, who in here has spent any time with React? I like it a lot. I hope that you all like it a lot too. I think it's a great project. It's a project out of Facebook. So you can go to facebook.github.io/React and read all about it. I just had to put this picture in there. This is funny to me on many different levels. First, because that's totally how I got into React. I heard React was good. But I don't understand this also. Why is there a cow up there? Why is it written by Macklemore? Why are there Chinese symbols? But it's funny, I'm looking forward to that book too. So this is what React looks like. This is a really simple Hello World React component. You can see it's pretty straightforward JavaScript, but some of you with the eagle eyes of youth may have noticed this strange looking thing up there. This is called JSX, which stands for JavaScript X. Now you might be a little upset seeing this because, what is the view code Why? That's HTML, and we're dealing with JavaScript, and those two things should never go together. We just spent all these years getting all of our JavaScript out of HTML, and now you're putting HTML in our JavaScript. Ouch. But Facebook has a really clever way of getting around this, in that React is just about the view. All that React, the purpose of React is to generate a UI. So React is only the V inside of MVC, so you don't have to worry about it anymore. Just wash your hands clean of that and enjoy React, because this is only the V. All we're doing here is presenting a view. The second thing that Facebook says about their React project is that it's a one-way data flow, a one-way reactive data flow. Now that might sound like a bunch of gibberish, but let me break it down for you a little bit. One way means that anything that happens in the UI loops back here to this thing called state, and then your UI reacts to the change in that state. So it's one way. When you click on a button in the UI, you don't immediately change something in the UI. That goes to the state. You change something in the state of your application, and then that is presented. That change is reflected in the UI, because the UI is an expression of the application state. So in other words, everything flows from state. And the third thing that Facebook highlights about React is this thing called a virtual DOM, which seems like that doesn't tell me much at all. The effect of this thing called the virtual DOM is that they're able to calculate DOM change sets, as I call them. So as the state comes back around and your component updates to reflect that change in state, you're not actually manipulating the DOM directly. When you do that, you're manipulating the virtual DOM, and then there's a mechanism inside of React that will compare the virtual DOM that you've just made changes to and the DOM that's actually in the browser, and then it'll make the little surgical changes. So it doesn't replace the entire DOM each time. DOM is document object model. It's all your HTML nodes on the page. So to wrap all that together, this is a quote from the Facebook documentation of React. React thinks of UIs as simple state machines. And by thinking of your UI as being in various states and rendering those states, it's easy to keep your UI consistent. So the key phrase up there right now is simple state machine. I'm going to take that concept and see what we can do with it inside of PHP. I want to spend a little more time in React, though, and look at a slightly more complicated example, maybe an intermediate level example of React now, and we're actually manipulating state here. So I'm sorry this is all white. The syntax highlighter doesn't understand React, and it was giving me colors, which would make it even harder to understand. But if we start at the top here, there's a method or function that's going to give the initial state of the application. And all that the component, this particular component, and all that this component knows about is the number of times that that button has been clicked. So when you first render that component, it has been clicked 0 times. And that's what you see in that first method at the top of the page. Under that, you can see a method that we use when we want to increment the number of clicks. And below that, the render method actually spits out your DOM, your HTML. And you can see on that button component, or on that button tag, we're telling React that whenever this button is clicked, we should call the increment clicks button. Increment clicks will then manipulate the state of your component. And this method here called setState. Once that is called, React will start its life cycle. Again, for this component, it will manipulate the state and then come back and ask the component to update itself. So there's that one-way data flow in action. It all happens around those calls to set state. So we manipulate the state, increment the number of clicks, and then the button shows up as having been clicked 1 time or twice or 3 times. So let's look at what this would look like inside of plain old HTML and JavaScript. This is what the HTML would look like, because HTML and JavaScript should be kept separate, right? So this is what's in your HTML file. You have a button. It starts initially with a text that says 0 clicks. And then this is the JavaScript. And it's colored now because it doesn't have any JSX in it, so the syntax highlighter works. So we need to create a jQuery version of the button. Then we need to extract the current number of clicks from the text inside of that button. Then we need to create a new text string that has the new number of clicks. Actually, I didn't even increment it there. You get the idea, though. And then if the number of clicks is not 1, we'll add that S and pluralize it. So set aside whether or not you like this, and that I don't increment it. Actually, that's a bug that I didn't mean to put in this slide, but there's another bug that I did mean to put in this slide. Can anybody spot it? That's kind of a trick question, because the problem is that the button tag on the previous slide had a different ID. Oops. So you can see the benefit of all of these things being together. Your JavaScript and your HTML is, by nature, pretty tightly coupled, and React is okay with that. So we come back to the example of the React. I just want to reiterate this concept of the one-way data flow and those 3 points that I talked about at the beginning of this section. What was that first one? It's the view only, just the view. The second one is that there's the one-way data flow, and then the third one is that we have the virtual DOM. So you can see how that all works here. This component, the function of this component is to render your view. You call setState, and it initiates this one-way data flow. You manipulate the state of your application, and then the component updates. And React uses the virtual DOM to make precise updates to the actual DOM. So for me, this is the real paradigm shift for us as programmers and how we think about our applications, or our UIs in this case. We can't just, when something is clicked, you can't just say, okay, now go change that to red. There has to be an underlying state that you manipulate when you click on that button that results in, maybe we're clicking on that more button at the bottom of an abbreviated paragraph to see the entire description of something. So we don't just say on-click, expand the paragraph. We say on-click, and then we come up to this state object that says, for that particular paragraph, and it says that this paragraph is expanded. Expanded equals true, and then it comes, and that React brings us back to the component, and we update the UI. Now that the paragraph is expanded, we render it as expanded. So we have to think about things differently. And for me, what that boils down to is the distinction between imperative and declarative. Imperative and declarative. For those of you not familiar with these terms, and I've heard people talk about declarative syntax and declarative APIs quite a bit, and I just kind of nodded and went along with it, and then one day I finally looked it up, and I said, oh, that makes total sense. So I want to take a break here and take a moment here and look at what imperative means and what declarative means. Imperative programming is using your code to explain how to achieve a certain goal. So if you're at point A, then you do this, you do this, and you do this, and you do this, and then you're at point B. Declarative programming, on the other hand, is simply explain your goal. I want to get to point B. So we can look at a plain old English example of this here. These are instructions for how to take the next right. If you're driving a car, you want to press the gas pedal down and increase your speed to 10 miles an hour, engage your right turn signal. As you approach, remove your foot from the gas and gently apply the brakes so you slow down a little bit. Check for pedestrians crossing the intersection. Check your mirrors and your blind spots for bicyclists. Lift your foot from the brake and then slowly increase your speed and turn the steering wheel to the right. So that's how you make a right turn. This up at the top, this is declarative, saying take the next right is a declarative statement. This down below is the imperative part, where it's actually explaining how to do this. Now, these are both valuable parts of learning how to turn right. But if you don't have the top part, if you don't have the declaration, then you're going to have to take some time and read these instructions and try to figure out what the actual goal is. Because we as humans can much more easily understand what's going on when we understand the goal. If we just take it step by step, we don't fully comprehend it. We follow the path and then we forget it. We don't have language to label what we just learned, and then it goes away. So both of these are very important when we are trying to understand something as humans, and likewise in your code. So if we look at this example of jQuery for incrementing the number of clicks displayed on this button, nowhere in this code does it say increment the number of clicks or increase the click counter. It just says, okay, so find the text in there, pull a number out of it, increase that number by 1, and then pluralize it, and then update the text. And by the end of that, you're going to say, oh, okay, so I think what this is doing is this. But you shouldn't have to do that. In this case, with React, it's very clear. You can see down at the bottom here, when the button is clicked, we increment the clicks. And the text of the button is the number of clicks, and then the word clicks, or click, if it's just one. So, real simple, if you remember nothing else about imperative versus declarative, is that imperative is how you do something, and declarative is what you want to do. How versus what. And this isn't any sort of groundbreaking new concept. This is something that's been around for as long as SQL, and probably more than that. This is a declarative statement. You're saying, show me all of the fields for users named Kris Wallsmith. You're saying what you want. You're not saying how to get it. You are declaring that you want any row that matches Kris Wallsmith as the username. Let's take this knowledge and then apply it to our PHP controllers. This, I'm glad we have a big screen. This is a PHP controller which is having us, what? A user is registering, and we're sending them a welcome email, and then saving that user to the database, redirecting to the home page. So this, you can probably guess, is an imperative controller. After the form is submitted, if the submission is successful, we are creating a new email message. Okay, so that's step one. And then with this email message, we're going to set the recipient, to the user. We're going to set the subject line to welcome. And then we're going to set the body, the content of the email to this, the results of this template. And then we're going to grab a service called the mailer, and then we're going to use that service to send this email. So by the time I got to the bottom of that description, you probably figured out what we were doing, which is sending a welcome email. But it doesn't say that. So this here is doing the same thing, but it's declarative. So you can see that we're going to send an email. We're declaring our goal. Our goal is to send an email to this user, or send a welcome email. Yeah. So that's much nicer. But why don't we go even further and do this? What? Kris, there's no more email. I find that building applications is much easier if you just drop the features. That's what you're clapping for? Okay, this is what's called a cliffhanger, and we're going to come back to that. But first, I want to talk a little bit about the Symfony Event Dispatcher. That was at Oregon State Fair, actually. Come visit. This is the text from the Symfony website about the Event Dispatcher. It allows your application components to communicate with each other by dispatching events and listening to them. Emphasis mine, dispatching and listening. We're going to take a closer look at the Event Dispatcher interface. It has a few more methods, but these two are really the core of the Event Dispatcher. On the top there, you can see that you can add a listener. If you have some code that you want to run in response to an event, you connect it to the Event Dispatcher as a listener. And whenever you want to dispatch an event, you would call that dispatch method. This is what it looks like. This is the most simple way to dispatch an event. You just call dispatch, and you give it the name of the event, and that's it. If you want to provide some more contextual information for that event, for example, the user that was created, then you can pass in a custom event class like user event here. So this is a class that you would create inside of your own domain. It would have a nice get user method, maybe some other helpers. Any listener that is listening to user create will get this event, and it will be able to do things with that user. That listener will understand that this user was just created, and then it can respond accordingly. Now, one thing that we typically do is set a constant on that event name, because we want to be sure that when you dispatch and when you listen, you have the same event name, otherwise they won't connect. So we ensure that by creating class constants like this, in this case, user events create. So that's how you dispatch an event. This is how you would listen to an event. That method add listener accepts a name of an event and then the code or a callable that you want to have executed whenever that event is called. So in this case, it's a very simple example. You can see the user event that we created before is passed as the argument to that callback, and then we simply echo a text saying welcome, and then ask the event for the user's name. You won't be doing that most of the time. Most of the time, you'll be using a service and then attaching that service to the event dispatcher as a listener. And so you would use this syntax for having asking the event dispatcher to call the onUserCreate method on this object, on this listener object. So that's the event dispatcher. It's pretty straightforward. You can add listeners. You can dispatch events. Coming back to this idea of Symfony and how it's grown over the past 10 years and how it's more mature now. There have been some growing pains, and when the event dispatcher was first introduced back in Symfony 1, this was one of the components introduced way back in the day, and we abused it, and a lot of people have abused it. So the guidelines that I would put out there for when to dispatch an event is that something has just happened or something is about to happen. So I don't want to throw shade on libraries using the event dispatcher poorly, but the basic idea, some of the things that I've seen are you ask a service to do something, and instead of doing it, that service dispatches an event and basically says, hey, does anybody want to do this? And then it'll just say, if there's no listener assigned to do that. So that's not what the event dispatcher is designed for. Event dispatcher. Something happened. An event. SymfonyCon is an event. I will dispatch the official SymfonyCon event later tonight. No, I won't, but that's the idea. Something happened. Okay, so we have these events and these listeners, and to come back to that cliffhanger from before, we have what I'm calling reactive listeners. If you remember the description of React, the one-way data flow. It's actually called a one-way reactive data flow. And I didn't want to garble that up with more words earlier on, but reactive is a pretty important word here because you are reacting. In the case of React, you're reacting to changes to that application state. In the case of the event dispatcher, you are reacting to events which have just happened. So let's look at what a reactive listener might look like in your application. Here we have this listener that listens to when a user is created and it sends a welcome email. Or if you maintain an activity feed of things that happen on your site so that users can see activity when they sign on, you can see that your user account was created, or you could see that somebody just follows somebody else. And this is another custom event class, the user event, which you might create in your application for an event that involves two users. So you would have the user and then the other user, and you could then log that follow in your activity feed. So breaking your application apart like this has several benefits. Number one, things become testable. You take one of these listeners, you can test it. The listener might just tie into a service, you can test that service. Your application code becomes reusable. You don't have to copy the same code from one controller to the next controller. It all happens. And it's more readable. You can take a look at these single responsibility listeners and see exactly what it's doing. It's got a nice declarative name, and then you would read, and it would make sense to you. It's easy to get up to speed on this stuff. So those are the listeners. That's the listener side. There's also the event side. So we're listening to these. We have these reactive listeners. What are they listening to? They're listening to events, to what I'm calling state events. And where do they come from? Well, you have a few options. Number one, option one, you could dispatch an event from the controller, which looks something like this. You have the same action from before. After the form submission is valid, we go ahead and dispatch that event. Then oh, shoot, I am not actually persisting the user there. But you would persist the user, and then you would flush the user down to database. This is option one. The issue with this is that every controller that does something, you have to then add an event. Like figure out if you need an event and add it in and make sure that you're not missing anything. The events are not coming from a central place. A lot of copy and paste in there. So option two is instead of having to paste that dispatch or create boiler dispatch code in all of your controllers, you could have that dispatch code happen inside of your service. So you might have a service that you call a user manager, and you would call persist this user. So inside of that user manager, you would persist the user, and then you would dispatch an event that user was just created. This is kind of silly, I think, because it's extra steps to jump through. In your controller, you would have to then call in this user manager and have this user manager persist the user for me. When all I just want to do is call the entity manager persist and then flush it. So there is an extra step, an extra hoop to jump through mentally by always having to call a service to do something like this. So option three is to dispatch from flush. The flush dispatch. And this is what I'm proposing. This is a flush listener. It's listening to the doctrine event pre-flush, and it's looking at your application and detecting any changes to your application's state, and then issuing events. So this comes back to that idea of React, where it's a one-way data flow. You make a change in React, increment the number of clicks, and then something responds to that change in application state. In this case, you can see that the application state has changed and that there is a user being added to the application. And we detect that in the flush listener here and dispatch an event that reflects that a user was just created. So your application becomes something of a simple state machine, similar to what we saw with the React component earlier. So that's pretty cool, right? But it's also kind of ugly. That flush listener is looping through everything. That's kind of, it just doesn't feel right. The word that you're looking for is imperative. That is imperative. So how do we make that more declarative? What if it was just this simple? On your user class, you add a simple annotation. Whenever a user is created, I would like this event dispatched. That's a declarative statement. Pretty nice. Whenever a user is changed, whenever an entity of this class is changed, I would like this event dispatched. Whenever we delete a user, I'd like this. Of course, you could group all of those together. And what about changes to individual properties? What if when someone changes their username, you would like an event dispatched so that you can respond to that? Or if someone favorites or unfavorites something? Or what if you only want events dispatched sometimes? So if you want a special event dispatched when someone favorites for the first time, and you can send them a little thumbs up, kudos. What about custom event objects if you don't want to use the default? If you have a custom event that follow class, what about this? What if you want an event? So you can soon do that. I really wanted to have it ready, but instead I put transitions on my slides. So that's what I propose. I want to get it up before I leave, because then who knows what's going to happen. And thank you very much. Any questions?
Hello? I have two questions regarding event ideas. I'm all in events, so no problem here. But did you find events hard to debug in big number of events? That's the first part. And second part, on Flash events, did you find that breaking the transaction on Flash can be problematic if you have like sending the welcome email on the Flash event? If it would fail, it would break the transaction of Flash, or shouldn't this be separated from?
Well, I'll answer that second question first. This is on pre-flush, so no Doctrine has not calculated any change sets yet. That has the benefit that you can still add new entities to the unit of work, and you don't have to do anything magical or complicated to make sure that Doctrine knows about that, because it hasn't calculated the change sets yet. The transactional thing, sometimes what I'll do is on that pre-flush, I'll actually stash something and then follow up with a post-flush, and then just send that email at that time. And then on the first question about debugging, that is a problem, and but for me, I want to tackle that problem and go with this declarative approach to organizing your code, and then solve these problems in the implementation.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, hello up there. I would come up on this amazing glass catwalk here, but I think I'd get kicked out. To debug the annotations, one thing that I'm working on is an actual some code generation so that it spits out this listener, and you can actually see the results of all of your annotations in one listener there. So you would be able to look at that.
Hello, and from your experience, is it okay to stop propagation of event, or if I feel a necessity of stopping propagation of some event is a bad thing and I should avoid this? Or is it okay? Is it just a good practice?
I don't think you should be stopping propagation because that is working outside of the state of the application. So with this way of thinking that I'm proposing here, instead of stopping propagation of the event, you would want to manipulate the state of your application in some way that results in subsequent listeners changing behavior.
If I feel a necessity of stopping propagation, I should consider redesigning in some way my application.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I don't want to tell you how to do your job, but you need a ship, but that is suspect to me, stopping propagation of events.
Okay, thank you.
I'm happy to stand up here under these bright lights a little longer. But I think we're done, so thank you everybody. I'll be wandering around if you want to talk.